trade, and one of these is the food safety standards. Now, we look at these notifications which countries make in the WTO to say what kind of standards they have put in place. In 1995, the number of notifications put by the WTO members were less than 200, and last year they had gone up to more than 1800. Now, obviously, the consciousness of the consumers in terms of food safety hasn't gone up those many times. What has really happened is that markets have become closed, and tariffs, if they have come down, have been replaced by non-tariff barriers, which are very difficult to handle. And in terms of subsidies, what has happened is that WTO has a very convenient mechanism of granting subsidies as far as the developed countries are concerned. There are some subsidies which are allowed to be granted by these countries, the WTO members, because the US and the EU, who drafted the agreement on agriculture, deemed that these forms of subsidies did not have any impact on production and trade. And these subsidies have been increased by US and EU quite substantially. These are subsidies which are not under any discipline under the WTO. So WTO really can't do anything about bringing them down. And in the WTO parlance, we call them box shifting. So they've taken these subsidies away from the box where discipline really could be imposed to ones where there was no discipline. And this box shifting has allowed the developed countries to give enormous flexibilities in the way they're managing their agricultural system. So very little can be done in terms of getting a deal now, because let me also mention that India was in the forefront of these negotiations, the WTO negotiations, talking about reform of agricultural trade and also of services trade, where we saw ourselves as demandiers in both the outsourcing activity and movement of people. But in most of these cases, in services sectors are not really open, and after the economic meltdown, services markets have become even more closed. And there are a number of measures have been taken by both the US and Europe, and Europe, particularly the United Kingdom, which are aimed at restricting the entry of workers into their territories. Now, Doha, I would say, is all but dead. There isn't any possibility of a deal coming through this year. It's too late in the day. Next year, the US the US presidential elections are taking place. So we're going to have a lame duck administration. So they're not going to be in a position to do any decision making in terms of a deal as big as Doha. And then only when a new administration comes in can they think about getting the Doha deal done. So I would say that a large injection of demand that the Doha round was supposed to bring in by rebalancing global trade is all but lost, and we have to wait a few more years to get anywhere near doing a deal similar to the Doha deal. But what the Doha crisis actually shows us is more symptomatic of a larger malaise, and this malaise is the crisis of institutions. The feature of the post-war period and this whole almost 5 decades of relative stability in the global economy that we saw was because there were certain institutions in place, and institutions like the World Bank and the IMF, despite its major shortcomings, was trying to sort of manage the global economy in a manner that it didn't get into or didn't face too many shocks. But today, what we see is that most of these post-war institutions are actually reeking, and the IMF needs a major makeover. It hasn't kept in sync with the changes taking place in the global economy. There have only been cosmetic changes in the form of slightly higher voting shares for the developing countries. And I would say that that's not the solution of the problem that we are facing. I would say that a change is required in the governance model of the IMF, and the decision making of the IMF has to be more participatory. More of these developing countries who have a large say in the global economy will have to be recognized. The new IMF chief, Lagarde, would know very well that she wouldn't have been in place if the developing countries had agreed on a consensus candidate, and we almost got our act in place, but not quite. And this is where developing countries have been failing us time and time again, and I think we need to get our act together much more. Now, it's quite clear that the global decision making in the global economy is no longer the sole preserve of the developed countries, and the developed countries themselves recognize this when they formed the G20 in the aftermath of the economic crisis, and the G20 is now trying to look at including other countries, and particularly a better representation from Africa, so that these regions which have not had a voice in the global processes can be included in this process. Now, one other important development that has taken place within the G20 is that for the first time in the last summit in Seoul, the G20 took the first steps to setting up a medium-term agenda, and the Seoul summit adopted a multi-year action plan on development, and this was an attempt to move out of the immediacy of the crisis, look at the problems afflicting the financial sector, and to find solutions to get the financial sector in place. And issues that were included in this in the multi-year plan of action were issues like food security, climate change, human resource development, and job creation. And you would all recognize that these are these are issues which, addressed, if addressed properly, would lead to significant change in the structure of the global economy. Now, even on the financial sector, there have been change in the thinking of the G20 members, and for the first time, the focus was on financial inclusion and the challenges that the SME sector faces in the financial sector was put in place. I'm sure that the Paris summit is going to see further articulation of the change that was set in place by the G20 summit. One of the major issues that is going to happen, the changes that is going to take place, and all the groundwork has been done in the run-up to the Paris summit, is that the basket of currencies that was underlying the special drawing rights of the IMF is going to undergo a change. For the first time, a developing country currency, that is the yuan, is going to be included. And already there's been a deal, and it seems that the Chinese had an arrangement or an agreement with Lagarde. They supported her candidacy in return for inclusion of yuan in the basket of currencies. Now, This, of course, is again symptomatic of the emergence of yuan as an international currency. This is something that we all need to look at with great deal of seriousness. The world is going to change, and I'm sure, as the dollar declines, and there are telltale signs of dollar declining. Yuan is going to emerge as the international currency, and already the Chinese are leveraging the strength of their economy in trying to push yuan onto the center stage. The Chinese government consciously started using yuan for their bilateral trade purposes from 2009. By the first quarter of this year, 7% of their trade was yuan denominated, and a recent survey which was done by HSBC indicates that by 2015, 50% of the trade that China would undertake will be yuan denominated, and this is a very significant development, and in India would have to watch this development very carefully and see what kind of measures it needs to take. One other important development that has taken place is that in our immediate neighborhood, a new monetary arrangement has come into place. It's in fact an arrangement which is mimicking the IMF, is a regional IMF which has come in, and this involves the ASEAN members, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, the 10 members of ASEAN, and plus 3 countries which are China, Japan and Korea. The ASEAN plus 3 had been talking about a monetary arrangement for some years now, and this was popularly called the Chiang Mai Initiative. And the Chiang Mai Initiative has now fructified into an ASEAN plus 3 macroeconomic office, which is set up in Singapore. And what the ASEAN plus 3 macroeconomic office is going to do is to mimic the work of the IMF in a regional context. And IMF is of course terribly worried about this development, because if Asia is going to be the growth center, and Asia has its own institutions to look after its problems, then of course the importance of IMF reduces quite significantly. So, and this is what I was talking about, that the global institutions seem to be on the decline, and the more vibrant regions are finding solutions to their own problems. Now, along with this development, one also has to see the formations within the developing countries, which are the emerging countries. I won't say developing countries entirely, but emerging countries, which are again assuming significance. And this again has the potential of rewriting the world economic order. The most important of these formations is the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and now South Africa, which is included in this formation. And the BRICS used to meet occasionally earlier, but at the insistence of the Chinese, they're meeting every year, and pretty much like the G8, which meets every year to decide as to how they are going to move the global economy. The BRICS is now setting the agenda on behalf of the developing countries. Of course, I would hasten to add here that it's not the collective, the BRICS, which is coming to the fore at this point in time. It's the Chinese, which is the China, which is moving their agenda, and some of us feel that India must get its acts together to put its own agenda on the table. Now, the challenge, as I see moving forward, is that there is need for a global governance agenda, and this should include some of the key areas where there are major issues of concern, and The first is, and this is just a list of issues, and we can talk about it in a discussion later on if and have more issues brought in. The first issue that I would say is becoming and is assuming crisis proportions is the entire issue of food. Food crisis has now assumed global crisis proportions. Prices of food are not likely to come down. There are chronic shortages emerging in different regions of the world. Ensuring food security through domestic production has become a major challenge for most countries. And FAO has been pointing it out for a long time that dependence on global markets and finding again easy solutions through imports is not really the solution. Countries have to strengthen their food security systems in order to get out of the problem that they are. I would also say that mere focus on production will not pay dividend unless agricultural institutions are in place which benefit small farmers. And if you look at India, and this is the problem with just not India but most countries, and we are quite familiar with this, that agriculture sector is bereft of strong institutions. And because these institutions are not there, we also find that we don't have even a proper market in place. After all, even markets need proper institutions to manage them. And as a result, of lack of a proper market, and I would say that in many countries, including ours, agriculture doesn't have a market the way we understand it, where the consumers and the producers meet to form prices. This is not really existing in India. So you have a system where the prices are formed by the middlemen. The farmers have no incentive from being in agriculture, and as agriculture faces this range of disincentives, I think we are only creating more and more problems for us. And Maharashtra has seen a lot of these problems in agriculture, and but we haven't really found any solutions. We have been flagging the problem of farmer suicides and the problem that the farmers have been facing in the market, but we haven't actually found solution for this problem. I've been arguing that the crisis that agriculture in India faces, because India is quite critical, Indian agriculture is quite critical to the way the global food crisis is going to pan out. Some of you would recall that first time we had this kind of sudden increase in prices, and particularly in commodities like wheat, was when India entered the wheat market. We had these shortages, and wheat prices haven't actually come down after that. So I would say that countries like India and China would have to be careful not to destabilize the global markets, and have to be taking care of their own needs. India, of course, is not in a position to do that, because if you look at our total production, we always say that we are self-sufficient. We are producing something about 240 million tons. But if you look at what China has been doing, China's production is 500 million tons plus, and with comparable population, you'll clearly know how undernourished our people are. So if more incomes are given to these undernourished people in India, obviously India is not a self-sufficient economy as far as our food sector is concerned. Now, what is the way forward? I would say that we need a kind of an agricultural plan. I think it's too late to talk about it anymore, because the 12th plan is already on the table almost on the table. We need an agricultural plan like we had the second plan, which was an industry plan, where the focus was on industrialization, and all our modern industrial sector grew out of the second plan. Today we need to work through our agricultural sector to get a big bang policy or big bang policy measures in agricultural sector to get agriculture out of this morass. Otherwise, this lagging sector is really going to pull the entire economy back. The second major challenge, and again something that we have not been addressing it as frontally as we should, is the environmental challenge. We all know that the carbon space is getting limited, but we also know that the rate at which developing countries are pushing the limits is really dangerous for the world as a whole. Now, we need to take steps collectively to address the environmental challenge. Again, I would say that the global processes here have failed us. We thought that we were going to have a global environmental governance structure coming through the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. We put in place a Kyoto Convention to discipline the developed countries. That, of course, hasn't happened to a very great extent, but the negotiations in the Climate Change Convention has not really gone anywhere. The UNFCCC is a divided house, and the developing countries have always come to the table and said that unless we have finance, adequate amount of finance and technology to back up, this is not going to help us in reducing the emissions of greenhouse gases. But I would say that even here, these kinds of discussions is not really going to take us anywhere. What is required are cooperative solutions where the developed countries and the developing countries work in partnership to get their act together. Otherwise, you are going to get into an enormous situation of confrontation, and this is exactly what is happening now. That many of us were fearful of the fact that someday the environmental standards, the environmental norms are going to be used as trade barriers in the global economy, and this is increasingly becoming a reality. The European Union is putting in place the carbon tax proposals, which are targeted at the big emitters like India and China, and some of these measures, of course, have been put on hold because of the economic downturn, because they don't want to be seen as to be aggravating an already kind of destabilized situation that we have in the global economy. But this is going to happen as soon as we find that there is more light at the end of the tunnel. So some of these issues, as I flagged, have to be looked at with a sense of responsibility by all the different actors. In an interconnected world, we all know that if the Americans sneeze, the cold, the Indians catch cold. So here we have to find solutions that is in the best interest of everyone. And although we have been talking about the global community as being one unified structure, we know that national aspirations have often been so dominant that they have undermined this process. And I've given you all these instances where national actions and trying to preserve the national space or the national interests have actually undermined the interests of the other countries. And I hope that as we move on, and I'm sure that the global economy is going to turn around, if not the next year, in a few years. Countries are going to learn hard lessons from the crisis that we have faced over the past few years, and are going to find solutions that are truly lasting and are sustainable from the point of view of the global economy. And I would say that when that day comes, we are going to truly have a new economic order, which will of course be very different from the situation that we have at this point in time. Thank you.
Thank you, sir, for your talk, for sharing your ideas and your thoughts on the topic. Sukalpa is here amongst us in the audience. I'd request you to felicitate her, please. Sukalpa, please come up on stage. This floor is now open for questions and answers. Please direct your questions to Dr. Dhar, and there'll be someone with a mic who will come up to you. You can address it to him, your questions. Thank you.
It's a generous social welfare schemes, and if you look at only the UK had this kind of a problem, but other countries which are facing much greater problem have had much less liberal social welfare schemes. So I think it's an overall problem of government spending, the way the governments have tried to use their resources. So it's not a very simple kind of you can't find very simple way out that that to reduce your welfare programs, you're going to find a way through your fiscal crisis. Of course, that seems to be the dominant discourse in both US and the UK, that to reduce welfare spending and you're going to get your budget in order. But it's not as simple. Of course, in the Euro crisis really tells us this, that you need to have fiscal union, you have to have discipline there, and of course when it came to disciplining the developing countries, IMF could use their iron hand to get the fiscal deficit in place. Those targets that have been set for individual countries were implemented very harshly. But here the European Central Bank kept on warning the different countries that your budget fiscal deficit is going out of hand. But since the Central Bank had no authority similar to that of the IMF, it couldn't have been implemented. So quite clearly the lesson here is that countries I think only listen when there is an iron hand. Otherwise, discipline is something that countries usually practice, and that is where the problem has been.
Good morning, sir. Sir, you spoke about the different deals that India also would be making. You also spoke about the Doha round. And you also spoke about financial inclusion and inclusive growth. So I would want to ask you that how would these different deals, at an international level, how would they help that section of the population, particularly for a developing country like India, which is below the poverty line?
I would say that, if you look at India and if you try to look at our aspirations in the Doha round, we really wanted to get a proper deal in agriculture, and a proper deal in agriculture if the markets had actually opened up and the markets were truly got rid of all these subsidies which are there, then these opportunities would have opened up for developing countries like India. And since the largest problem of poverty that we have is in the rural sector, I would say that some of these transmission mechanisms would have worked. In many other countries, the link is more direct. There is a case which has been actively discussed in the WTO of these cotton exporters of Africa. The poorest countries, the LDCs in Central Africa, which are cotton producers, they rely almost exclusively on cotton for their export earnings. And these countries found that their markets in the international markets were appropriated, I would say, in some by US, because kind of subsidies that were given to the US cotton producers really prevented these smaller countries from getting a look into this market. So, and as a result, and this has been shown quite well through all these numbers, poverty in these countries has actually gone up. These are Mali, Burkina Faso, Benin, and getting the fourth country. So these are the 4 countries, and quite clearly, because of loss of export earnings, poverty in these countries have gone up. So there was a direct link that we are seeing between trade, improved market access, and poverty reduction. Of course, the indirect effects are quite clear. That through a better Doha deal, a more equitable Doha deal, the kind of numbers that we were looking at in terms of welfare gains, and if the gains were skewed in favor of the developing countries, then there would have been a huge injection demand in these countries, and of course this would have helped to a great extent in the poverty reduction measures.
Good morning, sir. Firstly, thank you for your address. My question is, recently we have seen the Middle East going through a vast rapid change in the revolutions that are facing the so-called Arab Spring. So my question is, how does the Middle East till now featured in the economic order, and as they enter the uncertain future, what would be their presence in the new economic order?
No, the Middle East countries were not really very active in these in any of these discussions. There was a point when early on when Egypt was a major player in the among the developing countries. In the non-aligned movement of the past, Egypt used to be one of the leaders in the non-aligned movement, trying to shape the global political order. That was more of the political order. But more recently, we haven't found any evidence of the Middle Eastern countries really taking the front seat. Part of the problem has been that most of these economies have been totally dependent on the Western powers, particularly the Americans, to do the thinking for themselves, for them. And of course, the lack of any of democracy and people's voice being sort of articulated in these countries was another big problem. Now, as we see, and if this continues, this the changes taking place in the political order in most of these Middle Eastern states, if this continues, and if you find that people are able to articulate their views more freely, I'm sure that these countries are going to play a more active role in shaping of the economic order. After all, they are the economies which, at least in the foreseeable future, are going to have a lot of financial resources, and of course, the dependence of the global economy on fossil fuels is not going to go away, very quickly. So these are economies which have huge resources. If these resources can be used for the development, and here we are talking about the global resources that we need for development, and if the development fund can be increased through these resources provided by the Middle Eastern states, we could see a transformation of many of the LDCs to begin with, and I'm sure that this is going to happen in the next few years.
So one question, what is the significance of NAM now?
Well, non-aligned movement was a creation of the Cold War period. So in the 50s, in the post-war period, and these two poles came up, the Soviet bloc and the US bloc. Countries like India, Egypt, Indonesia, leaders, and these are the leaders of the developing world then, they decided that it is not in our interest to be a part of any of these blocs. So it's in our interest to be our own masters. We'll decide our own destiny without being tied to these big powers, and therefore the relevance of NAM was there when it was established. Subsequently, of course, as I was mentioning, that the breakdown of the Soviet Union and the unipolar world, the question of being non-aligned really didn't exist, because there wasn't any the second pole. So the relevance of NAM as a political kind of an entity which is equidistant from both blocks really became irrelevant. Of course, in the context of the UN, the non-aligned bloc was also doubling up as a group of 77, which was the bloc which was articulating the views of the developing countries, the interests of the developing countries. And from this group of 77 came a series of very important developments in the UN, and one of them was a special UN resolution in 1974, which talked about the development of a new international economic order. And the new international economic order had some very significant targets. For instance, one of which was subsequently adopted in Lima in Peru, talked about developing countries having a share in the total global value addition of 25% by 2000, by the year 2000. So those kinds of targets were actually I would say, outgrowth of the new international economic order. The G77 exists even today in the UN. Of course, UN as a decision-making body has largely lost its relevance because it's just a talk shop. But some of these developments that had taken place then are now being seen as the building blocks of what developing countries are doing at this point, as I mentioned, through breaks and other forums, to recreate the world order, which they think are better is better balanced and provides a more equitable share of the resources, global resources.
Good morning, sir. You just spoke about withdrawal of subsidies and opening up of agricultural markets as a measure of eradicating poverty. But we just saw last year that when subsidies were withdrawn, it triggered off the biggest food inflation in India in years. So where do we go from there?
No, I was mentioning about the withdrawal of, or reduction of subsidies by the developed countries, the US and the EU. Because one, of course, as I was mentioning, that the subsidies are being given to an agriculture which is patently inefficient. It uses huge amount of resources. It's an extremely resource-intensive agriculture, and is also uses it's almost industrial agriculture, chemicals to such an extent that it's polluting the world to an even greater extent. So from many accounts, you could say that this is an agriculture which is not really desirable, and if there has to be if agriculture is truly to be promoted, it has to be promoted in countries which do it better and which are now planning to get into our organic agriculture and a more benign agriculture. Now, subsidies in developing countries has to be there for in the foreseeable future. I would say, no matter what we say in terms of what extent the subsidies are increasing and what kind of pressure it's putting on our fiscal planning. But I would say that as long as we are unable to handle poverty directly, we will have to continue with the subsidies bill. Now, of course, there are suggestions for restructuring this whole subsidies regime. And now we are talking about targeted subsidies and giving direct subsidies and where people matter. And the model that we are trying to follow is what the Brazilians did. They had these targeted subsidies and they called it bolsa of familia. And I'm not too sure how much of this is going to be successful in India, because for one, we have been thinking about it for a while, because in the US also you have a direct income support which is given to farmers, and government in India has been thinking about direct income support, but the cost of sort of implementing these schemes are going to be so prohibitive because of the large population involved, something that deterred us then, and I don't know how far it's going to be successful now. At the end of the day, it would deter us even now. But subsidies in some form or the other will have to continue.
Sir, good morning, sir. So you talked about carbon credit. The Kyoto Protocol Agreement, which is actually governing this carbon credit, hasn't been ratified by US, which is a major polluter. So has this concept of carbon credit been successful in reducing the global emissions?
No, only to the extent that some of these schemes have been implemented in the in European Union. Now you have this carbon equalization system, which is, the market has been created for carbon credits in the European Union, the emissions trading scheme, which is there from 2005. Now, the emissions trading scheme, to an extent, and this is what the evidence shows us, has helped the European Union to address the problem of greenhouse gases to an extent. And Europe therefore has emerged as a model for others to follow as to how to deal with this issue. But of course, the flip side that briefly was mentioning was that European Union is now planning to take this emissions trading scheme across the border. And what it was now planning to do was to have to impose its own rating on other trading partners quite unilaterally. So what would have happened is that if the same levels of emissions that EU accepts nationally would be imposed on other countries, and if India exported, say for instance, steel to the European Union, and the level of emissions in the Indian steel industry was higher than those that acceptable in the European Union, then a carbon tax is proposed to be introduced or to be imposed on the Indian export. So now the carbon credit has two sides of it. As long as it used nationally, because I would say that because it has cross-boundary implications, even if one country or one region does something to reduce the emissions of greenhouse gases, the impact would be felt globally, because to that extent, this particular region is vacating a bit of the carbon space. And the whole idea behind the Kyoto Protocol was really this, that while it was accepted that we have a limited carbon space, developing countries needed more carbon space for their development. As they industrialize and they, emit more greenhouse gases, they would need the carbon space. And where would that carbon space come from? It will come from the developed countries vacating that space, undertaking emission reduction measures, and through incentive mechanisms like the carbon credit and also the CDM, that investing in the developing countries in cleaner technologies, and this kind of kind of a market-based mechanism where you have there are incentives and punishments embedded in the same kind of a system, which is going to deliver. So so I would say that the carbon credit is something that is an important step, and India needs to look at carefully. But again, the problem with India is that you can't really impose it across sectors, because in every sector you have a very large component of the small and medium size enterprises, and you do not have much flexibility, and you really can't have these emission norms cutting, imposed only for small and medium sector, because emissions vary from sector to sector. So while I would say that it is important for us to look at this mechanism of carbon credit, the mechanism for reducing greenhouse gases. After all, we have assumed voluntary emission cuts by 2020. But which would be the mechanism, what would be the mechanism, what variant of a carbon credit are we going to follow to really implement it? That's the big question.
Sir, we extensively discussed the Doha round, and a lot of the developing nations, they have blamed the developed nations for not cooperating enough, as a result of which the round failed. But the developed nations, especially considering their current situation, why would they ever want to roll back on any of their incentives or whatever are the schemes they have in place for their agricultural productivity, especially the developed nation?
Yeah, that is the whole tussle, because see the developed countries are refusing to do it, but the whole purpose of engaging in international negotiations is to do a quid pro quo. You're going to say that, and the good thing about the WTO and the Doha round in particular was that you're looking at the entire plate at one go. There are all these sectors. You have agriculture, industry, you have services, you have a plethora of rules, and everything was put together. And the idea was that this whole deal is going to be one single deal. There would be, trade-offs within sectors. There will be trade-off across sectors, and therefore this whole single undertaking for in the WTO is going to be done because each country is going to find something or the other, some advantage and some maybe in agriculture if US gives in something, it will get some benefit. Maybe in services, maybe if agricultural subsidies had come down, India would have agreed to give better access to American firms in the services sector. So maybe retail trade would have been opened up much more easily because there would have been a trade-off between agricultural subsidies and retail trade. So now the whole sort of negotiating construct that was sort of the dynamics that was thought of was based precisely on this kind of an architecture, that you have a whole range of options. Someone is going to find something interesting somewhere else. But unfortunately what has happened is that for the US, agricultural sector is vitally important, and there are some very interesting documents which have been produced in the past where it shows that let me just elaborate a bit on this, that US is one country and the other is the European Union, which regularly formulate agricultural policies, and most of the developing countries, including ours, we have a very large percentage of population dependent on agriculture. Of course, share of agriculture in GDP is down to 12%, but share of population dependent on agriculture, directly on agriculture is 50%, and rural population is almost 70% even today. But none of the developing countries have these agricultural policies that the developed countries have put in place. And interestingly, the first, very few people recognize this, that even know this, that one of the first legislations that the US Congress enacted in the 30s, when in the aftermath of the Great Depression, was the Agricultural Act, and the Farm Act. And the Farm Act, first Farm Act came in 1933, and till today, every 4 years, US Congress enacts a legislation. The last legislation was enacted in 2008. It goes up to 2012 next year, and that is almost a 500-page document. And anyone has the patience to go through it. It's a lesson for all of us as to what we should do in terms of agricultural policy. Only 2% of their population is dependent on agriculture. Gives them a similar percentage in terms of GDP. But yet, the Americans treat agriculture and give such primacy to agriculture precisely because of food security concerns. When the last bill, one of the earlier bills in 2002 was enacted, the House Congress came up with a document with a quote from George Bush And he said that George Bush said that this country is secure because we produce our own food, and food security is equivalent to national security. So, and of course, this was in the aftermath of the 9/11, where of course, there were these rhetorics that America can't depend on unsafe sources in the third world for its food needs. So, if this is the level of sensitivity that US has, of course, it is not going to let go agriculture at any point. And because subsidies are required to keep agriculture in place, subsidies will have to continue. Now, the problem is that for WTO is that this is an area that is up for negotiations, and US is saying that, well, I want my markets in the developing countries, so India must lower its tariffs and give my products better market prices. But when we turn back and say, what about your subsidies? They say, no, subsidies are very important for us because it is very important for our farmers to be in place. So this is the contradiction that we have actually found. That one is the national interest, national interest which comes in security, and the other is the trade interest, and they are conflicting in a very perverse manner as far as the US negotiating stance is concerned.
Good morning, sir. I'm Shantanu. I have two questions, but the origin is same. One is the basic crisis of the modern world is the food crisis itself. So what is the issue of the plant breeders' rights in this context? Because plant breeders' rights itself the supply-driven policies, and ultimate food crisis is coming from this particular part, particularly in the developing one, in part of the developing world, so far the economic policies are concerned. Second thing is there is a regular, this kind of, in the WTO regime, there is no provision for the local knowledge protection. Okay, so however, these kind of things, particularly from one point of view, there is the plant breeders' rights, and another kind is there is no provision of the local knowledge, particularly in respect of agriculture. Do you think this kind of thing ultimately leads to the food crisis? Food crisis.
No, the issue that is being discussed in the WTO is somewhat larger. What is happening is that, as most of you would know, that the WTO also includes an agreement on intellectual property rights, and the agreement on intellectual property rights basically recognizes of all the knowledge generated in the formal innovation system. So and these are covered by the known forms of intellectual property, patents, copyrights, and what. But no local knowledge. Yeah. Now, but what happens to informal, the knowledge system? What do we do about this? Now, what we have also found is that over the past couple of decades, some of the traditional knowledge that, or not some, but quite a bit of this traditional knowledge has been repackaged by the modern innovation system, and new products have been developed on the basis of traditional knowledge, and patents have been taken on these products and processes. And one of the most discussed thing is this whole neem patent on neem, where a product was developed. That is right. So so what happens is that there is a problem of free rider which comes in, because already our local traditional knowledge has given very vital leads which a modern scientist can then pick up and then sort of distill a little further, process it a little further and get a patent on it. So the risk, that is right, so the risk that is involved in developing a new product is substantially reduced because all the earlier groundwork has been done. So without any problem, I can land a successful product in the market. And as you know that if you are doing sort of conventional chemistry and you try to get a new molecule, the success rate is extremely less. And if you look at the past 3 decades, proprietary products, the patented products, Glaxo, in the next 3 years, Glaxo is going to lose almost 2/3 of these products. 2/3 of these products are going to come out of patent. And most of the major companies like Eli Lilly, Merck are going to face a similar situation. Now, this is where they are trying to grab the traditional knowledge. And traditional knowledge which we have not been able to market very well. These are now being sold as proprietary products by these multinationals the world over. And therefore our contention in the WTO was that if you are going to recognize modern knowledge through these forms of IP, you also got to take note of the traditional knowledge. And there has to be some mechanism where there is a case of benefit sharing that takes place between the owners of traditional knowledge and holders of traditional knowledge and the patent holders who are someone who is going to develop this knowledge and get a new product, who is going to commercialize. So we say that we don't have a problem if Pfizer goes and sort of markets our products, traditional products with traditional knowledge in the global markets. What we are interested in is a recognition that they are using our product. So there has to be prior informed consent. They have to take consent from us that they are using, and there has to be a benefit sharing arrangement. So pretty much like Pfizer would insist that if anyone uses Pfizer's technology, there has to be a royalty paid. There has to be a license and a royalty paid. We are saying that we have kept this knowledge in place through the millennia. Today we are able to access this knowledge. So you have to pay a royalty to us. So there is going to be a benefit sharing, and this has to be formalized in the WTO, where so the whole knowledge system, the circle is completed in the present context, in the context that I just mentioned to you, only when traditional knowledge is recognized and a formal system is put in place where benefit sharing actually takes place. So this can also extend to agriculture. The agricultural practices again, we have many of these traditional seeds. They have more strength and and today when some countries are thinking of going organic, there is a treasure house of traditional seeds which are available in many countries. So if the Monsantos and others, the Cargills are thinking of using these seeds and market their products, then there better be an arrangement which is entered into between the Monsanto and the traditional holder or holder of traditional varieties, and so that the full circle is complete.
Sir, you mentioned about the yuan getting its weightage in the currency with the IMF. How do you feel this is going to impact the Indian currency, and how do you see this?
No, the yuan coming into being used as an international currency is a major issue for us, particularly when we are also looking at the Southeast Asian countries as a big market, and it's part of our Lupi's policy. And what I was mentioning was that the whole framework of monetary cooperation that is coming in Southeast Asia through this Asian ASEAN plus remapping of the already there are indications that the ASEAN countries are supporting using of yuan as the common currency. Now, if yuan comes in as common currency, of course, China already has an advantage, and what yuan can do to China will be quite similar to what the Americans have been doing with the dollar. So what today? Why? What are the I would say what are the problems for exporters? One of the things is that the movement of the dollar really starts affecting our exports. Now, since we do not have control over the value of the dollar, we feel helpless, and we are not helter-skelter when dollar appreciates, and of course vice versa. The advantage that the Chinese are going to have is that they're going to have control over the value of the yuan. They, in any case, have been controlling the value of the yuan. No matter what the Americans spoke of, what the real value of the market value of the yuan was, the monetary authorities ensured that the value of the yuan was met. So they are going to use this value of the yuan, and they're going to provide further fillip to their own economy. And my apprehension is that this is something that some of the bigger companies who have been talking to have been telling me, that as the Western world gets into this problem of deeper prices, and in the next 2 years they're not going to come out of this crisis, the Chinese are increasingly going to look at India as the market. They're already India, China is the largest trading partner. We're importing a lot from the Chinese. One other thing that we need to also look at is the way the Chinese actually are manipulating the trade with the developing countries. I should have mentioned this. That recently there has been a dispute in the WTO where the Chinese have been called out for deliberately limiting exports of raw materials from their country, because what the Chinese want to do is that they do not want to export their raw materials, but instead they're absorbing, they're importing raw materials from the rest of the world. And I did some calculations to see what their trade pattern was with the major countries. With Brazil, it's astonishing that 97% of their imports from Brazil comprises of intermediates and raw materials. For India, it is 93%. And so it's virtually colonial trade, and what they're exporting is finished products. It's virtually colonial trade as we knew then. So, and if China can can extend, and quite obviously China can extend its footprint, this kind of trading pattern in other regions, with the backup of its own currency.
Sir, I have two questions. The first one deals with the heterogeneity of interests among developing countries. Interests among developing countries, particularly at multilateral negotiations. For example, you have, in the case of agriculture, you have the net food importing countries as one block. In case of textiles, we have the Istanbul Declaration. So, how do you foresee the developing countries moving beyond this fragmentation? And can there be something coherently? Can we have something coherent between them? The second one deals with the mention of BRICS in your talk, and some reports have already sidelined Russia from that because of its over-dependence on natural resources, and they have included not only South Africa but also Indonesia. So, can you please comment upon this churning of the presumed growth engines of the world?
Yeah, this has been your first question is what is being touted as one of the weaknesses of the developing countries, that they are not they don't look similar. They are very different in interests, and there is a lot of differentiation there. And so can they speak in one voice? Now I think that gradually we are seeing the emergence of these differentiated groupings of countries, and one of course just mentioned BRIC, the BRICS, and Indonesia, and Egypt was also being talked about before they got into this crisis. So you're going to have this kind of the emerging countries being sort of this number of emerging countries increasing, and this is going to form one kind of a group. Now, in the WTO negotiations, particularly in the agriculture negotiations, you have already seen such kind of a thing happening. In the agricultural negotiations, we had two groups of developing countries. There was another G20 out there, and this were the more advanced developing countries, led by Brazil, India, China, Thailand, all these countries were there. And then there was another group of countries, the G33, which was more of these, sort of defensive countries, led by, of course, by Indonesia. India also was there. But the greater voice in in this group, there were 46 countries finally. These countries, the voice was being led by the Africans and the smaller countries, and they had their own kind of concerns, and they had their. So what happened as a developing country position in the WTO, the agriculture negotiations, was a kind of a converse combination of these two. So the must-have elements of these agendas were taken on and were put on the table. And I would say that moving on, you're going to see such kind of a process also happening. The second thing which will be very important is that as the emerging countries bloc, politics or whoever comes in here, this group, if it has sufficient wherewithal, and I hope it has, this will start shaping the global agenda, sort of putting ideas on the table. Today, despite our journey into the world of emerging nations, we find ourselves constrained because the agenda is being set by someone else, and we are only responding to an agenda. We are only reacting to an agenda. And so I hope, and some beginning was made in the BRICS summit last BRICS summit. But of course, this agenda was more China oriented, as I mentioned. China was driving this agenda. The next BRICS summit is going to be hosted by India, and it will be very good if some of you can start talking about it, and start writing about it. And what is it? How does India perceive of itself as a global player? And if India has to perceive of itself as a global player, what are the issues that it must face? And what are the issues on which there can be a common cause? One can't be only looking at oneself, but also one has to look at interests of the other countries. And that's where some amount of research is involved. That this is an interest primarily of India, but of course we can join. So many other countries can join in, and we can see through the same prism, and make it to a global issue, which can have sufficient traction on the other side. So this is where I see the developments actually moving forward.
Good morning, sir. This question is again from agricultural sector. Sir, you have talked about making ways for agricultural exports. Sir, when the country is already facing double-digit food price inflation, don't you think that instead of promoting export, we should actually stop it? And sir, because at the end of the day, we need food in our plates and not the foreign exchange. So what you have?
No, I think you will. I think you will also recognize that agriculture is not about cereals altogether. Of course, in India, a large part of agriculture is cereals and basically a wheat-based economy that we're talking about. But then there is the remaining part, a large part of which is horticultural products. I think you would also know that India is the second largest producer of horticultural products. What are the problems? And this is something that we should do as case studies. That a large part of our horticulture products get wasted because we do not have proper, sort of storage and value, cold chains and all the infrastructure that is required. Now, again, one other thing that has to be looked at, and this is again some ideas can be generated from here, that while we have our these horticulture products are produced in some regions, some parts of the country, the processing centers are far away from those, and some steps have been taken by by Himachal Pradesh to address this problem. What they have done is that right next to where these their orchards and their orchards are, they have started putting up small processing units. Okay. So even if you do some rudimentary processing, increase the shelf life of the product, you get some pulp and and so forward it to a larger production center. You may not need a whole cold chain for that purpose, but there are some innovative ways in which you can improve or decrease wastage on the field and in transportation. So I would say that India has a huge potential there. It's a largely unexploited market. Of course, what needs also to be done that it's easy to say that you need to export, but it's quite difficult when we look at the other side and see that there are very stringent food safety standards being put on the other side. So whole I would say coherent thinking needs to go into how we are going to look at this sector. And as I said, I mentioned in a very broad front that agriculture development should be taken as a part of the 12th plan. It should be the central focus, and that's where I would say that you start looking at the different segments of agriculture and how different segments of agriculture need to be turned around. For instance, cereals, again when looking at cereals, we are also facing this whole problem of industry versus agriculture, urbanization versus agriculture debate. Land is not available apparently. So you have, even if you are looking at food crops, you have to look at ways of productivity and or what have you. So you have one set of issues in your cereals. You have another set of issues when you're looking at more of the commercial crops, and all that has to be put together in a large agricultural plan, and I would say that that is the only way of taking agriculture.
Good afternoon, sir. As you mentioned in your speech, you said that the growth centers or the current growth centers such as China and India should take lead as far as world politics is concerned. You also said that now is a chance for the world to push towards inclusive development. And China, such as we know that it's stepping up its efforts to be the world leader, such as promoting yuan to the vehicle currency and so on and so forth. Sir, but these countries have traditionally not had a very good record as far as development is concerned. I mean, they are the growth centers, they bring in the money, yes. But as far as human development index and other measures are concerned, these countries are still backward. Or let's just say they are not in the same lead as the developed countries. So my main question is, how do you think these countries will be able to change their administration to bring about inclusive development in a new world order?
I think the leads have been given by you yourself, because these countries are lacking in terms of whole range of human development indicators. That's where the focus needs to be. And if you look at China's experience in the aftermath of the downturn, when of course China has been asked by many, not to take its surpluses and park them in other countries, but to use it for their own development. What they did was they started investing heavily in human development and in health and education. The amount the Chinese have invested in the past couple of years is just quite enormous. And this is these are the mainsprings of inclusive growth, and even we recognize it. If you look at our 11th plan document, which is of course on inclusive growth, and you just look at the way it has been articulated, that what are the mainsprings of inclusive growth, you'll find that health and education have been put right in front. So I think that we know what it is all about, how this is going to take place. But what is really required is that the government, not just ours, but in most other countries which require it, they have to be sincere in their efforts in promoting these sectors. So it's not enough to say that I'm going to have universal primary education as my class, or sort of literacy as my class. What am I going to do with my population, and how am I going to impart the necessary training and create the skills which are required? In fact, if you look at the way the IT and ITS sectors have been developing, you'll find that already people have been talking about the fact that we are at the threshold of skill shortages. We aren't generating enough skills so that the industry can readily use them. In many cases, industry picks up bright minds and trains them, and then they are actually ready for the industry. So there is a disconnect between what we have as the education sector, or the focus on the education sector. Now, for instance, we are focusing almost entirely on the primary sector, forgetting about secondary and tertiary. Some changes have taken place in this budget, but there is a huge problem, so that it almost feels that our target is just to get that primary education targets fulfilled. And after that, what happens to the rest of the population, how those kids who are coming out from primary education, what happens to them? We have no interest in how they develop further. So you have to have a seamless kind of a structure developed in the education sector, looking at the skill requirements that this country of this country, and that alone is going to help in our inclusive growth strategy. Otherwise, it's just going to be bits and pieces.
I'm afraid we cannot take any more questions because time is up. I'd request thank you, sir, for your patient hearing and taking each question and answering them one by one. I'd request Kalyan Shankar now to do the vote of thanks.
Distinguished professors, guests, faculty members and students, it is a pleasure and privilege to have Professor Biswajit Dhar amongst us here today. And on behalf of the Symbiosis School of Economics and the Symbiosis fraternity at large, I would like to thank him for accepting our invitation and addressing this inaugural lecture for the MSc students. And only a person of his scholarship could have spoken so insightfully on a subject that is as complex and evolving as the new global economic order. Thank you so much, sir, once again, and we look forward to a more continued association of yours with our institution. I would also like to take this opportunity to thank all the faculty members and students who have been working behind the scenes to make this event a success. Thanks a lot. To conclude the proceedings, I would request everyone to please stand up for the National Anthem. Okay. All the faculty members are requested to come to the conference room back door. Thank you.